Firstly, a little apology. This talk was supposed to be given by my colleague, Dr. Zara Beth Newton, as she's the academic coordinator for case-based learning in the medicine course up in UHW, but she couldn't make it today, so I'm afraid it's me. And for my sins, I was one of the many contributors to the new version of the medicine course that we have now up in at the Heath campus. And I'm one of the case writers for the cases that students do. So the reason that we'd like to talk to you about this today is that we feel that not only is it innovative in terms of what it can give the students, but it's also translational. I think that, perhaps people were expecting, if we're going to talk about medicine, that we'll be talking about something very high-tech, cramming patients into MRI tubes or hooking them up to ECG machines. Actually, what I'm going to describe to you in terms of the headlines is a very simple approach to enabling student learning, but we're seeing some real benefits from it. So really, just some background first. It's a big course, medicine, at Cardiff. We've got over 300 students per year. It's a 5-year program, and we answer to the General Medical Council. We're regulated by them, and our students ultimately will register with them after their training with us. So we use a variety of staff to help deliver the curricular components of the course, both Cardiff University employed staff and NHS partners and other healthcare providers. It's a very, very diverse learning environment for the students. And what we changed relatively recently, about 3 years ago, was the way that we structured the curriculum. Up until 3 years ago, we had a very sort of traditional course structure to the 5 years, in that it was very, very lecture heavy, it was very, very didactic. It would be somebody like me standing in front of students for hours on end, talking at them about medicine, and not really putting too much of an emphasis on enabling their own learning. So with the C21 iteration of the medicine course is what we're actually currently running now, and it's the C21 component that actually incorporates case-based learning. And to answer perhaps the unasked question, what's the difference between case-based learning and problem-based learning? Largely just words, but genuinely when we were designing this course to have this element, we genuinely don't consider patients to be problems. So we think we're sending out the wrong message by saying that a PBL course perhaps links to the patient as a problem. The patient isn't a problem. So case-based learning has all the elements of a medical degree course, but focused with a patient at its centre. So a lot of the early learning that the students do actually has this anchor point of having a patient at its centre. So the curricular structure, as you can see, we've now split into distinct phases. So we have phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3. Broadly, the 5-year structure sits below that. And actually, in terms of where the case-based learning component fits in, largely years 1 and 2. And years 1 and 2 is where we have designed a number of cases that the students have to explore. And at the end of those 17 cases that run over years 1 and 2, they should have enough core knowledge and skill sets to set them up for the more extended clinical learning activities they have in years 3, 4 and 5. So a little bit about CBL, case-based learning, in those first 2 years. The components and the way that we structure it was specifically designed to promote and enable active learning in the student. A conscious decision for us to move away from the more didactic standing up and talking at students, which really isn't too productive given the nature of what medicine is and what we're trying to generate in terms of our graduate. We're trying to generate graduates that have a very, very comprehensive skill set, both in terms of scientific knowledge, sympathetic skills, translational curiosity in terms of what they're able to do and bring to society in general. And we weren't, I think, doing that particularly effectively with the old version of the course. So when we talk about a case-based learning, we have a randomized group of 10 students, and they have to explore a patient scenario. And the patient scenario is designed to cover specific learning outcomes that we have to deliver according to the General Medical Council. And that group of 10 students has what we call a staff facilitator. And the facilitator is there just to guide the students through each 2-week case. A case will last 2 weeks, and when the students meet up and have their small group sessions, their case-based learning sessions, they will meet 3 times over a 2-week period, and each of those sessions will be facilitated by a member of staff. Now, the key thing here is that the facilitator doesn't teach that subject, okay? And again, it was a bit of a mindset change for both staff and students, in that students initially perhaps expecting the member of staff to be the smartest guy in the room. That doesn't apply when it comes to case-based learning. The facilitator is there to make sure that the elements of the case as designed are being explored appropriately by the students. They can provide a steer. All the case-based facilitators are given a case handbook which details what the case's remit is, so that they can actually effectively have their crib notes, but they're not there to teach the session. They're just there to make sure that things stay on track and the students don't go off down a blind alley. So, your tax dollar at work with these IT functions here, aren't they? Right, so what are the 7 steps of case-based learning? Well, what is absolutely crucial to the enablement of student learning is this concept of the student groups, the 10 students in a group, going through these particular steps associated with case-based learning. So we give them a really quite vague patient scenario, deliberately vague, and the students would probably say quite frustrating. And the reason we make it a vague scenario is that we don't want to signpost a specific problem, pathology, disease, condition, issue with the patient, because that makes it too much of a blinkered experience. So, for example, I've written a cardiology case with colleagues that runs from this week over the next 2 weeks, and the patient scenario is very vague for the students. A patient presents with some palpitations, and the students then have to explore where those palpitations might have come from, how you manage the patient, how you counsel the patient about concerns. So the underpinning science, the clinical domains, and the broader holistic aspects of patient care. But to define, or to enable rather, the case-based process, the students do have to go through these steps. So they have to go through the case scenario, and this first step is really critical, defining any terminology, because it'd be surprised to see how quickly and easily students skirt over really quite simple terminology that actually when you push them on it they don't understand. And again, that's one of the roles of the facilitator. So for example, the patient scenario that I've written for the second year students at the moment, the patient has spells of dizziness, and the students will quite happily read through the scenario and say, yep, we know what dizziness means. But then actually when you get them to explore what dizziness means, you realise that perhaps they don't have the required level of insight and understanding into dizziness. And it's not then for the facilitator to teach them about dizziness, it's for the students to go off and explore the areas that they actually find they do have some uncertainty with. So they can define the problems and issues associated with the case, both clinical, scientific and social. All those elements are engineered into the scenarios. The students then have to share what they know about the issues that have been identified. Remember, some of the students will actually have some prior knowledge. They might have a friend or a relative that might have gone through a particular or similar type of scenario as the one being described for their case. So they can bring knowledge to the table, and they can sometimes answer the questions that other students come up with. That's a very empowering activity for all the students. And then they need to explain, they need to arrange rather the explanations that they come up with, and they can identify any gaps that they have in their knowledge. Remember, the cases take 2 weeks. They meet 3 times, so they have an initial meeting that describes the case at face value. Then they have a week's worth of activities that are adjunctive to the case-based learning session. So we don't just leave them hanging. They have, within a 2-week structure, very specific themed activities relating to the case. So for example, again, the medical students over the next 2 weeks doing the cardiology case will have workshops on ECG interpretation. They'll go out on community placements to pharmacies and discuss with them how the pharmacists deal with complicated cardiovascular patients suffering from palpitations. So they do have plenty of structured and themed activities relating to the case-based sessions they do, and those adjunctive materials help them fill in the gaps, if you like, in terms of their knowledge. But they also have to promote within themselves this concept of independent study. So at the end of each session, they set themselves work that they have to do, and the work really forms the basis of learning outcomes. So they have the higher level learning outcomes associated with the case that we reveal to them, but it's up to them to flesh out the details. So at the end of each session, each small group session, each case-based session, the students have set themselves tasks to say, okay, we've identified X, Y, and Z learning outcomes that we feel are really important to help describe this case, and we are going to go off for the next week and actually populate those learning outcomes with our own independent study. And so when they come back at the end of 2 weeks, they have a final wrap-up session where they put the case together as they understand it, again, under the steer of the facilitator to make sure there aren't any massive gaps, and then just to make sure everyone's reading from the same page, the case writers for a particular case will also provide a summary wrap-up at the end of that 2-week period to make sure that everybody is on the same page. So we do have 17 cases that we cover through years 1 and 2, 6 cases in year 1, 11 cases in year 2. The adjunctive material forms, in terms of the methods, are lectures, plenaries, practicals, clinical demonstrations, clinical skills learnings, obviously going out into community, obviously interacting with real patients, all linked in with the case scenario. It is logistically challenging to deliver. Years 1 and 2 equal over 600 students. One small group of students is 10 students. 10 students requires one facilitator, so we need to have 60 plus trained facilitators and suitably equipped facilities to allow these small group sessions to go on. Timetabling that at the Heath campus is really quite complicated and challenging, and training the facilitators to do what they need to do from a facilitation point of view is also quite challenging as well. So it is a logistical, not headache for us, but it is certainly quite interesting to try and deliver this type of learning to this number of students. And it's only really an issue because we do have such a high number of undergraduate medical students. So what have we learned from doing case-based learning? It does work. We are still in the process of running our first cohort of C21 medical students through the 5-year course at the moment. So we are in the process of gathering feedback and data relating to how efficacious case-based learning is. But certainly, anecdotal evidence that we're gathering from colleagues out in the NHS, obviously our first and second year students who went through the first pass are now in third year and doing extended clinical placements in district general hospitals and other healthcare centres. The NHS staff are all telling us how impressed they are with the mindset of the students that have gone through case-based learning. They are commenting on the different approaches that this new generation of medical students who've gone through case-based learning are bringing to their clinical placements. Now that's not for 1 minute to say they ever had a big problem with the previous, if you like, old-style medical students. They are simply commenting that these new case-based learning trained students have a different way of approaching their clinical placements, and they are finding it very refreshing. That curious mindset, that self-directed learning attitude that the students seem to have is going down very well out in the hubs. It is staff intensive. We can't dress that up. Facilitator consistency has to be closely monitored. If we've got over 60 facilitators or a requirement for 60 facilitators, medical students do one thing very well, and that's compare notes, and we need to make sure that we have a good, consistent quality of facilitator. And we do that through a number of mechanisms. We gather feedback from the student groups, we have peer review processes, we have training, support, guidance, and we are confident with our mechanisms that Dr. Newton has actually been spearheading, that we are providing a very, very consistent facilitation given the diversity of our facilitators. Some of them are researchers, some of them are clinical colleagues, some of them are out-and-out teachers, but we do a good job of providing facilitator consistency, and that helps again foster the best possible student experience. So we think it's working. Certainly the anecdotal evidence is pointing towards that. Obviously we'll only know how effective case-based learning is in the context of what kind of doctors we generate in a few years' time, because we've still got students going through this first iteration. But it works, it's translational, it does require a lot of staff, it does require a lot of goodwill from the staff, it's very, very labour intensive, but it certainly seems to be a hit both with the students and also with clinical colleagues who then have to go on to the clinical training components of the MBBCh. So, thank you very much for your time, very happy to take any questions.